if I told you that our ancestors in the harsh and cold Middle Ages slept completely differently, and their approach was much wiser and healthier than ours? You've definitely never heard these facts before. They didn't have central heating, down comforters, or pajamas, but they knew how to turn their modest dwellings into real fortresses against the winter cold. Their sleep was not an escape from reality, but a natural continuation of it, subject to the rhythms of nature rather than an alarm clock. This is a story about how ingenuity, tradition, and a deep understanding of the world around them allowed people not only to survive, but also to fully rest during the darkest and coldest times of the year. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn why the practice of double sleep was considered the norm, how an ordinary bed was turned into a warm room within a room, and what forgotten secrets of medieval life can help us sleep better today. What if I told you that absolutely everything you firmly believed about healthy, proper sleep and its continuity is completely untrue and a modern myth? The very idea that a person must sleep for one continuous 8-hour block per night is a relatively recent cultural invention, born of the era of mass artificial lighting, urbanization, and the Industrial Revolution with its factories. In the Middle Ages and earlier, people slept completely and radically differently in terms of their sleep patterns, and this alternative sleep system was deeply and organically integrated into their traditional way of life, determined by the change of day and night. The modern sleep pattern is a product of industrial society, not the natural norm of the human body, which has evolved over millennia in different conditions. Historians and anthropologists, carefully studying ancient documents, personal diaries, fiction, and even court records from the Middle Ages, have discovered a surprising fact. For medieval people, so-called segmented or biphasic, interrupted sleep with a break in between was completely normal and natural. The night was naturally divided into two main separate periods of rest, historically known as first sleep, or primus somnus in Latin, and second sleep, secundus somnus, respectively. This established practice of separate sleep was so widespread and accepted throughout Europe that medieval doctors, church priests, and poets wrote about it quite calmly as a self-evident, normal phenomenon that required no explanation. No one considered it a problem or a sleep disorder. It was the norm for all walks of life, from peasants to kings. The first sleep usually began shortly after sunset, usually around 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening by modern reckoning. Tired people went to bed almost immediately as soon as the onset of darkness made most work and activities physically impossible or extremely difficult without expensive lighting. This first period of sleep lasted about 3 to 4 hours until midnight or 1 a.m., after which a period of spontaneous wakefulness naturally followed, when a person woke up on their own without an alarm clock. This awakening was not the result of external stimuli, but occurred naturally as part of the body's biological rhythm, attuned to the cycles of nature. This intermediate period between two sleeps, usually lasting from 1 to 3 hours, depending on the person and circumstances, was definitely not insomnia or a sleep disorder in our modern medical understanding of the term. On the contrary, it was a calm, relaxed, and often very productive time for various quiet activities. People usually stayed in their warm beds under the covers to keep warm, but engaged in a variety of quiet activities by the dim light of the moon, shining through the window, or by the glow of the embers in the hearth, which provided minimal lighting. It was a period of rest, but not sleep, when the body rested and the mind could be active. During this quiet nighttime, literate people could read religious or secular books if you were educated and literate enough and could afford the luxury of lighting an expensive candle for illumination, which was not available to everyone. Or people could pray in silence, addressing God alone. Many medieval religious texts, prayer books, and breviaries of the time contained special prayers and psalms intended specifically for this special nighttime period of wakefulness between sleep called vigil. It was the perfect time for deep reflection on life and death, self-analysis of actions, spiritual practices, and meditation in silence, when nothing distracted from one's thoughts. The silence of the night was conducive to spiritual concentration and self-knowledge, which was highly valued in the religious culture of the Middle Ages. For married couples sharing the same bed, it was an ideal, intimate time for closeness and tenderness, as directly confirmed by many medieval medical treatises and manuals of the era discussing conception. Doctors believed that after the first rest and sleep, the human body was more relaxed and physiologically predisposed to successful conception. It was also a wonderful time for quiet, confidential conversations between spouses alone, calmly discussing the events of the past day and making plans for the near future without witnesses. In the hustle and bustle of the day, there was often not enough time and privacy for such conversations, and staying awake at night provided a rare opportunity for communication. After this period of nighttime wakefulness and activity, people naturally fell asleep again without effort, gradually sinking into a deep second sleep until morning. This second sleep continued uninterrupted until dawn and the first rays of sunlight in the window. Waking up finally in the morning with the roosters, a rested person felt completely refreshed, alert, and ready for a new working day with its challenges and tasks. Biphasic sleep provided quality rest that was not inferior to modern continuous sleep, and possibly even surpassed it in its restorative effect. This natural two-phase sleep system was perfectly synchronized with the innate natural circadian rhythms of the human body, undisturbed and unaltered by the artificial blue light from numerous gadget screens. Modern scientific research by sleep specialists convincingly shows that in the complete absence of artificial lighting and electricity, the human body naturally and biologically tends toward this type of biphasic, segmented sleep with an interval. Thus, the medieval sleep regime was not inferior to the modern one in terms of the quality of rest, but simply fundamentally different, more flexible, adaptive, and harmonious with natural rhythms. Perhaps it is we who have deviated from the norm, and not they who lived incorrectly. This intermittent, fragmented sleep pattern also allowed people to effectively perform important, practical, nighttime household duties that could not be ignored. Someone had to periodically throw fresh wood into the smoldering hearth so that the fire would not go out completely before morning and the house would not freeze. Mothers could breastfeed their awakened babies in a timely manner and calm them down, while the owners of the house could check through the window or by going outside to see if everything was in order, with the cattle and horses in the barn or stable attached to the house. The period of wakefulness between sleep was functional and necessary for running a household in conditions where many processes required constant attention. Modern medicine and somnology are only now beginning to gradually recognize the scientific fact that nighttime awakenings are not always and necessarily a pathology or sleep disorder requiring treatment. Perhaps periodic awakenings are just an evolutionary echo of an ancient, genetically ingrained biological survival mechanism that we have artificially suppressed and ignored in favor of a rigid industrial work schedule. Medieval man wisely did not fight this natural state of nighttime wakefulness as if it were a disease, but rather used it wisely to the maximum benefit of the soul, body, and practical needs, integrating it into his life. It would be very interesting to hear your balanced opinion on this issue. What exactly do you think about this historically divided two-phase sleep? Is it a natural biological mechanism of humans that we should return to? Or is it simply a necessary temporary measure due to uncomfortable living conditions and lack of lighting? Write about it in detail in the comments below, sharing your experience. Are you ready to learn the truth about the heart of a medieval home, around which all life and death revolved? In an era when winter meant not just cold, but a real threat to life, the hearth was the main element of any dwelling. It was not just a source of heat, it was the center of social life, the kitchen, and the only source of light during long, dark evenings. In most simple peasant houses, the hearth was simply a stone-lined area in the center of the only room. There were no chimneys as we know them today. Smoke rose and escaped through a special opening in the thatched roof or simply seeped through it, disinfecting and preserving the straw along the way. Keeping the fire going was a sacred and vital duty. The fire had to burn from late autumn until spring. An extinguished hearth in the middle of a cold night was tantamount to disaster, as it was extremely difficult to rekindle it with flint and steel in the dark and cold. At night, the fire was not extinguished, but covered with ashes, so that the coals would continue to smolder until morning. In the morning, it was enough to fan them by adding dry chips and firewood. This practice saved both fuel and the energy required to produce fire. Fuel was a precious resource, the preparation of which took all summer and autumn. Peasants were only allowed to collect dead wood in the forest, fallen branches and twigs. Cutting down living trees without the feudal lord's permission was strictly forbidden and punishable by huge fines or even more severe penalties. Not only firewood was used, anything that could burn was used: peat, dried manure, compressed straw. The quality of the fuel directly affected the amount of heat and smoke in the house. So good, dry logs were highly valued and used sparingly. The entire evening life of the family revolved around the hearth. Dinner was cooked here in a pot suspended over the fire. All the household members gathered here to warm themselves, repair tools, spin, or simply talk, escaping the damp darkness outside. The heat from the hearth was distributed unevenly. It was hot near the fire, while frost could form in the corners of the room. Therefore, the most honorable and warm places by the fire were reserved for the head of the family and the elders, while the rest sat further away. Animals, especially young ones, could also spend the night in the house, near the same hearth, during severe frosts. Their own warmth helped to heat the room further. The boundary between living space and barn in simple houses was very arbitrary. Thus, the hearth was not just an element of the interior, but the beating heart of the house. The health, livelihood, and very survival of the family during the long winter depended on its condition. It provided not only physical warmth, but also a sense of security and community in the face of the hostile cold. Which element of everyday life do you think was more important? The fire that provided warmth or the walls that preserved it? But even the hottest hearth would be useless without a properly constructed sleeping area, which was a real fortress against the cold. In the next chapter, you will learn how the medieval bed was transformed into a separate warm room. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the medieval bedroom, which will change your perception of personal space. Today, a bed is a purely intimate, personal place. But in the Middle Ages, everything was different. A bed was not just a piece of furniture for sleeping, but a multifunctional center of social life and a real refuge from the cold, often shared by the whole family. First, forget about the image of an elegant bed with a soft mattress. In a peasant's house, it was often just a wooden box or a platform nailed together from planks and stuffed with straw. Straw provided excellent insulation from the cold earthen or stone floor and was an affordable material that could be replaced regularly. On top of the straw, a mattress was laid, also stuffed with straw, wool, or rags. This layer added a little softness and extra insulation. Rough linen sheets were a luxury that not everyone could afford. Many slept directly on the mattress, covered with cloaks or woolen blankets. The most important element of the bed, especially in wealthy homes, was the canopy. These were heavy curtains made of thick woolen fabric that surrounded the bed on all sides. By drawing them closed at night, people created an enclosed space, a kind of room within a room. This fabric cocoon effectively retained the heat emanating from the bodies of those sleeping. The temperature inside such a bed tent could be several degrees higher than in the rest of the frozen room. This simple but ingenious solution significantly reduced heat loss during sleep. Whole families slept in such a bed.
It's all right.
Parents, children, everyone lay down together under one blanket. This was not a whim, but a harsh necessity. The more people, the more heat they generated. The concept of personal space was completely different, and sleeping together was considered the norm. In wealthy homes and castles, beds were true works of art. They were made of carved oak, had massive posts for attaching a canopy, and were so large that not only the owners, but also their guests could sleep in them. Refusing an offer to share a bed with the owner of the house was considered an insult. The bed was the most valuable piece of furniture in the house. It was often passed down through generations and specified in wills. Having a large bed with a canopy and a feather bed was a sign of high status and wealth. Sleeping in a sitting or semi-sitting position was also common. People placed large pillows and bolsters under their backs. It was believed that sleeping completely horizontally was harmful and could lead to a stroke. Thus, the medieval bed was not a place of solitude, but a collective fortress. It united the family, protected them from the cold, and served as the center of evening life. It was a microcosm of warmth and security in the middle of a large and cold house. What you are about to learn will change your perception of nighttime rest. We are used to special clothing for sleeping, pajamas and nightgowns. But in the Middle Ages, this concept practically did not exist. People slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, or without clothes at all, using other ways to stay warm. For the vast majority of peasants and townspeople, clothing was too expensive to have separate sets for day and night. The main clothing was a long shirt made of linen or coarse wool. It was in this shirt, worn under outer clothing during the day, that people went to bed. The linen used to make undergarments was a practical material. It absorbed sweat well and was relatively hygienic. However, it did not keep the wearer warm, so other daytime clothing was often left on top of the shirt for sleeping. On cold nights, people could sleep without taking off their woolen stockings, breeches, and even daytime tunics. Only the outermost dirty and bulky clothes were removed. The principle of layering, which saved people from the cold during the day, continued to work at night. Members of the nobility could afford special nightshirts, which were longer and wider than daytime shirts. However, even they often slept in several layers of clothing in cold stone castles. In addition, they wore a nightcap on their heads. A nightcap was a mandatory sleeping accessory for people of all classes. A significant amount of body heat escapes through the head, and a simple cloth cap or nightcap helped to retain it. This item of clothing was so important that it was worn by both men and women. Warm socks or stockings were used for additional warmth. The feet were one of the most vulnerable parts of the body to the cold. Therefore, people tried to keep them warm even while sleeping by wearing several pairs of woolen stockings. However, many poor people slept naked. In this case, the only protection from the cold was a straw mattress, a single shared blanket, and the warmth of other family members' bodies. This was the most basic, primitive way to keep warm. Clothing was not only protection from the cold, but also from insects that could live in straw mattresses. A tightly tied undershirt created at least some kind of barrier. Hygiene, as we understand it, did not exist, and clothing played an important protective role. Thus, there was no special pajama fashion in the Middle Ages. Clothing was utilitarian and multifunctional. It served its owner around the clock, protecting him from the cold, both during daytime work and nighttime rest. But clothing and beds could only retain the heat that was already there. How did medieval builders try to keep precious heat inside their homes? In the next chapter, you will learn why small windows and low ceilings were a sign of wisdom rather than poverty. A medieval house was not just a dwelling, but a well-thought-out system for conserving heat. Every detail of its construction, from the foundation to the roof, was subordinated to one main goal: to survive the winter. To modern people, these houses may seem dark and cramped, but there was a harsh logic to their design. The windows in medieval houses were very small and few in number. Glass was incredibly expensive and only available to churches and the castles of the wealthiest feudal lords. Ordinary people covered their windows with oiled parchment, ox bladders, or simply wooden shutters. Such windows hardly let any light in, but they also did not let precious heat escape. The fewer openings there were in the walls, the easier it was to heat the room. In winter, windows and doors were tightly closed and covered from the inside with thick fabrics or skins for additional insulation. The walls of peasant houses were most often built using the wattle and daub technique. This was a frame made of twigs, thickly coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. Such a wall was light, cheap, and most importantly, had good thermal insulation properties. In more affluent homes, the fachwerk technique was used, a sturdy wooden frame, the gaps between which were filled with the same clay or brick. Wood itself is a good insulator, and such houses were much warmer than those made entirely of stone. Stone castles, although impregnable, turned into real ice caves in winter. The roofs were covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds. A layer of straw, 30-40 centimeters thick, was an excellent insulator, comparable in its properties to many modern materials. Such a roof not only protected from rain, but also reliably retained the heat rising from the hearth. The ceilings in the houses were low. This was done to reduce the volume of the heated space. The smaller the space, the faster it warmed up from a single hearth. The interior decoration also helped to conserve heat. In wealthy homes, the walls were hung with expensive tapestries and carpets. In poor homes, they were covered with straw mats or simply animal skins. This created an additional insulating layer that protected against drafts and cold coming from the walls. The floors in simple houses were earthen. They were covered with a thick layer of straw or dry grass. This layer not only insulated the floor, but also absorbed dirt and waste. And in the spring, it was simply raked out and replaced with a new one. The entire layout of the house was often organized around one large common room, in the center of which was a hearth. Separate bedrooms were a luxury. This arrangement minimized heat loss and helped to concentrate heat in one place. Thus, the medieval house was like a thermos. Its main task was not to be beautiful or spacious, but to conserve as efficiently as possible the small amount of heat that could be produced. It was architecture born of the need for survival. Ready to find out what food helped people not freeze to death in their beds? Body heat depends not only on external sources, but also on internal fuel. The winter diet of medieval people was not very varied, but it was ideal for the main task, generating the maximum amount of energy for warmth. The diet was based on high-calorie foods that took a long time to digest. These were not light salads and smoothies, but thick, rich soups and porridges. The main source of energy was carbohydrates obtained from grains, rye, barley, and oats. Bread was king. Dark, dense rye bread was the basis of every meal. It was filling and provided a long-lasting feeling of satiety, slowly releasing energy and maintaining body temperature. Proteins and fats were no less important. Meat was not available every day, but in winter, pork appeared on the table. Pigs were slaughtered in late autumn, and their meat was salted, smoked, and dried, while the fat was melted down and stored for use throughout the winter. Lard and animal fat were the main sources of calories. They were added to soups and porridges and used to season vegetables. It was fatty foods that gave the body the energy it needed to combat the constant cold. Legumes, or peas, beans, lentils, were another important part of the winter diet. They were cheap, stored well when dried, and were an excellent source of both protein and slow-release carbohydrates. Thick pea soup with lard was a classic winter dish. Vegetables were mainly consumed in canned form. Cabbage was fermented, cucumbers were salted, and root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, were stored in basements and cellars. These products were a source of essential vitamins, albeit in small quantities. Hot food was a must. People tried to eat immediately after cooking, before the food cooled down. Hot soup or porridge not only satisfied hunger, but also warmed people from the inside, giving them an instant feeling of warmth. Hot drinks were often consumed before bedtime. These could be herbal teas or warm beer, known as ale. Spices, such as ginger and cloves, were often added to ale, which also had a warming effect. A hearty dinner was the key to a warm night. A hungry person freezes much faster. Therefore, the evening meal was the most abundant, as it had to provide the body with enough fuel to survive a long and cold night without a fire. What do you think was the most important food for survival in winter? Bread, lard, or cabbage? But even the most satisfying food could not change the main law of nature, which dictated the entire way of life. In the next chapter, we will talk about how darkness controlled the sleep and wakefulness of medieval people. Today in developed countries, we are almost completely independent of natural sunlight for our daily activities. When evening twilight falls, we simply turn on the electric light switch and continue to live, work, and entertain ourselves as actively as in broad daylight without noticing the difference. In the Middle Ages, such a convenient option of artificial lighting simply did not exist in principle, and the inevitable onset of darkness with the setting of the sun meant a radical, dramatic change in the entire way of life and activity of people, especially during long winter evenings. Darkness dictated the rhythm of life for the whole society, from peasants to kings, and no one could escape its power, no matter how rich they were. Winter days in the northern latitudes of Europe were depressingly short, with only a few hours of full daylight, while nights were disproportionately long, lasting up to 16 hours and almost completely dark. The artificial lighting available was extremely primitive in terms of efficiency and prohibitively expensive for most of the population. The most accessible, free source of light for the common people was an open fire in a central hearth or fireplace. But it gave only an uneven, flickering, dim orange light, effectively illuminating only a small space with a radius of a few meters around it. Beyond this circle of light lay impenetrable darkness in which it was impossible to distinguish objects or perform any precise work requiring vision. For additional spotlighting, poor households widely used splinters, thin, long pieces of dry, resinous wood, most often pine or birch. The splint was carefully inserted at an angle into a special metal or wooden holder called a candlestick, and it burned slowly for only a few minutes, emitting acrid smoke and constantly requiring replacement with a new one. This was tedious, distracting from work, and extremely dangerous as sparks could ignite the straw on the floor or wooden structures. Constant supervision of the burning splint was required, making it impossible to concentrate on complex work. Tallow candles made from solidified animal fat were much more convenient to use and durable, but were significantly more expensive for ordinary people. They were handmade from sheep or beef fat, smoked heavily, smelled unpleasant of burnt fat, and provided relatively little useful light compared to modern candles. Only relatively wealthy middle-class townspeople or successful craftsmen who had to work in the evenings to fulfill orders could afford to burn expensive tallow candles every night. For peasants, tallow candles were a luxury used only on special occasions, such as holidays or important family events. Beeswax candles were a real luxury that was inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. They burned brightly, evenly, with almost no smoke, and had a clean, pleasant honey scent. But they cost a fortune due to the limited production of wax. They were used almost exclusively in wealthy churches for services and in the luxurious homes of the highest aristocracy for special occasions. For the common man, seeing a burning wax candle was a rarity, available only when visiting a church on major holidays. Due to the high cost and extreme inefficiency of any artificial lighting, most of the active social and economic life of society came to a virtual standstill when the sun set below the horizon. The working day of peasants and craftsmen was strictly structured, with no alternative to the length of daylight hours without deviation. As soon as the sun finally set, absolutely all fieldwork and most craft work requiring good lighting and precision ceased immediately. There was no point in continuing to work in the dark when it was impossible to see anything clearly, and it was easy to injure oneself or spoil the product. The short evening hours after sunset were devoted only to those simple tasks and activities that could be performed in the dim light of a dim hearth, practically by touch or memory. Men could leisurely repair leather harnesses for horses or methodically sharpen blunt tools on a whetstone, tasks that did not require bright light. Women traditionally spun wool or flax using a simple spindle, which did not require good lighting thanks to the automatic nature of the movements. Unlike fine needlework or complex embroidery, which required distinguishing small details. These monotonous activities could be performed almost blindly, relying on muscle memory and years of experience. For the vast majority of ordinary people, the long, endless winter evenings in the dark were a rare time of rest from hard work and family gatherings by the fire. The whole family would gather closely around the warm hearth to save light and heat, telling each other entertaining stories and legends, singing folk songs and ballads passed down from generation to generation. This was a precious time, which today we would call quality family leisure or family values. But it was born not from ideology, but from the lack of practical alternatives for entertainment. People were forced to communicate with each other, as there was nothing else to do in the dark, which strengthened family ties and the transmission of traditions. The early onset of pitch darkness directly and significantly influenced the sleep patterns of the entire population, determining them completely. It was completely pointless and economically disadvantageous to stay awake in pitch darkness with nothing to do, wasting expensive candles. Therefore, practical people naturally went to bed much earlier than modern city dwellers, often 2 or 3 hours after sunset, around 8 or 9 in the evening. There was no reason to stay awake in the dark when it was impossible to work, read, or do anything productive. So sleep was a logical choice and a way to spend the long night in a healthy way. The entire life cycle of medieval society and of each individual was strictly subordinated to the movement of the sun across the sky without exception. People got out of bed at the first rays of dawn, sometimes even before sunrise, in order to make the most of the short daylight hours and get as much work done as possible, especially in winter. This natural biological rhythm of life, synchronized with natural cycles and the change of day and night, was the unshakable foundation of human existence for many millennia before the invention of affordable artificial lighting. The sun was the main regulator of life, and its power was absolute for everyone, without exception. In the modern world, survival is most often an individual task. We rely on our own strength, money, and technology. In the Middle Ages, it was almost impossible to survive alone, especially in winter, and the power of the community and collective habits came to the rescue. The principle of sleeping together extended beyond members of the same family. In the large halls of castles or monasteries, people often slept in one huge room. Servants could sleep on straw mattresses right on the floor by the fireplace in the main hall, using the heat from the large fire. In peasant houses, especially during severe frosts, neighbors could gather in the warmest and most protected house to spend the night together. This allowed them to save fuel and warm themselves with each other's body heat. The principle of better crowded than offended was not a saying, but a guide to action. Travelers and pilgrims caught in bad weather could always count on a place to stay. They were led into the house and put to bed with everyone else, by the hearth or even in the master's bed. Hospitality was not just a virtue, but an important element of social mutual aid. Keeping the fire going was also a shared responsibility. In some communities, there was a practice of a public fire, which was kept going in one of the houses and from which neighbors could take coals if their own hearth went out. This was a manifestation of collective responsibility. Firewood preparation could also be a communal task. Men from several families could join together to go to the forest for dead wood. This was both safer and more efficient than acting alone. Holidays that fell during the winter, such as Christmas, were not just religious dates, but an important social mechanism. They provided an opportunity to get together, have a big feast, and light many fires. It was a way to collectively withstand the darkest and coldest time of the year, raising the general morale. The entire village or community felt like a single organism surviving in harsh conditions. People understood that the well-being of their neighbors was directly linked to their own. If one family could not survive the winter, it would weaken the entire community. Even the layout of the villages helped to conserve heat. Houses were often built close together, creating narrow streets. This protected the buildings from the biting winter wind, creating a warmer microclimate within the settlement. This spirit of collectivism was not the result of a high moral choice, but a pragmatic necessity. The cold was a common enemy, and it could only be defeated by working together. The ability to share the last piece of bread or a place by the fire was the key to collective survival. Hibernation and survival did not begin with the first snow, but long before it. All summer and autumn were spent working tirelessly to prepare for the long period of cold and darkness. People's lives depended on how successful this preparation was. The main task was to gather fuel. Throughout the warm months, men and teenagers went to the forest every day to collect and bring home a sufficient amount of deadwood. This firewood and branches had to be stacked correctly in a woodpile so that they would dry well before the cold weather set in. The second most important task was to prepare food supplies. The harvest had to be not only gathered, but also properly processed for long-term storage. The grain was dried and poured into chests, protecting it from rodents and moisture. Vegetables and fruits were preserved by all available means. Cabbage was chopped and fermented in large barrels. Apples and mushrooms were dried by stringing them on threads and hanging them under the roof. Root vegetables, such as turnips and carrots, were stored in cold cellars sprinkled with sand. Meat and fish were salted, dried, and smoked. These processes required time and knowledge, but they allowed people to preserve a valuable source of protein for the whole winter. Slaughtering livestock was an important event in late autumn, after which the whole family was busy processing the carcasses. Repairing the house was no less important. Before the rains and frosts set in, it was necessary to carefully inspect the house and repair all the cracks. The walls were recoated with clay, and the roof was covered with fresh straw so that it would not leak and would retain heat better. Clothes and shoes also needed to be prepared. Old clothes were mended and holes were patched. Women spent the entire autumn spinning wool and flax to weave new fabric and sew warm clothes for the whole family. The livestock also needed to be taken care of. The barn was insulated, the roof was repaired, and enough hay was harvested to feed the animals until the spring grass grew back. The health of the cows and goats was essential for the family's survival. All of this work required tremendous effort. Summer and fall were times of labor from dawn to dusk. Every member of the family, from young to old, was involved in this process of preparation. The successful completion of all these tasks gave hope that the winter would be survived. A full cellar, a high wood pile, and a repaired house were the best guarantee of peaceful sleep on cold nights. Winter was not a time of rest, but the result of summer and autumn labor. It would seem that what can the experience of survival in the dark and cold Middle Ages give to modern man? We live in a world of technology, comfort, and almost unlimited access to resources. However, if we look more closely, we can learn some very important lessons from the past about how to sleep properly and live in harmony with our bodies. The first and most important lesson is the importance of synchronizing with the natural rhythms of light and darkness. Medieval people went to bed when it got dark and got up at dawn because they had no other choice. We, on the other hand, use artificial light to extend the day into the night, staring at bright screens that emit blue light, which suppresses the production of melatonin, the sleep hormone. Perhaps we should learn to let go of the day earlier. Dim the lights a few hours before bed, put away your gadgets, and read a paper book. This simple action can help our bodies remember their natural settings and prepare for a good night's sleep. The second lesson is the concept of biphasic sleep. Our obsession with 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep causes us to panic when we wake up during the night. We consider this insomnia and reach for sleeping pills, instead of using this time for peaceful wakefulness, as our ancestors did. If you wake up in the middle of the night and can't fall asleep, don't panic. Try not to fight it. Read, meditate, think about something pleasant in the dark. Often, when we stop fighting sleep, we fall asleep much faster. The third lesson is the importance of a cool temperature in the bedroom. Medieval people slept in cold rooms but created a warm microclimate in their beds with canopies and multi-layered blankets. Modern research confirms that for healthy sleep, the temperature in the room should be quite low, around 18-20 degrees Celsius. We often overheat our bedrooms, which disrupts the natural processes of thermoregulation during sleep. It is much healthier to sleep in a cool room, but under a warm blanket. This is closer to the conditions to which our bodies have adapted over thousands of years. The fourth lesson is the collective aspect of rest. We perceive sleep as a purely individual process. But for our ancestors, it was part of communal, family life, which provided a sense of security and protection. Of course, we don't need to go back to sleeping together in one bed, but perhaps we should appreciate more the evening time spent with our loved ones. Quiet conversations, reading together, or simply being together without distracting gadgets can create an atmosphere of peace and security that is the best introduction to a good night's sleep. And finally, the last lesson is the importance of physical labor and nutritious, natural food. Our ancestors worked hard physically and ate simple, high-calorie food, which contributed to deep and sound sleep. We, on the other hand, often lead a sedentary lifestyle and eat light or, conversely, unhealthy food before bed. Regular physical activity and a nutritious dinner, rich in protein and complex carbohydrates a few hours before bedtime can work wonders. When our body receives the necessary exercise and nutrition, it is much more willing to immerse itself in restorative rest. Past experience reminds us that we are part of nature, and ignoring its laws always comes at a price. We can see that the medieval approach to sleep was not primitive, but surprisingly pragmatic and deeply connected to nature. There was no room for anxiety about getting the right 8 hours or panic about waking up during the night. People simply followed the sun, warmed each other with their body heat, and used the dark hours of the day as their bodies dictated. Perhaps in our race for comfort and efficiency, we have lost something very important: the ability to listen to our bodies and live in tune with their rhythms. The history of hibernation in the Middle Ages is not a call to abandon the benefits of civilization, but a reminder that wisdom is sometimes hidden not in new technologies, but in the centuries-old experience of our ancestors. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. We are very interested to know which historical mysteries and survival secrets from the past intrigue you the most. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.